Over the past several years, Tradwives have been the topic of conversation across the internet, as people like Ballerina and Nara Smith flood our feeds with aesthetically pleasing versions of their homemaking lives. Think dresses and aprons, swaths of uniquely named children, and cooking elaborate meals from scratch in a perfectly lit kitchen, not a stain or a mistake to be seen. Every detail is intentional, whether these types of content creators admit it or not. They're influencers after all, it's their job to influence. And what exactly are they persuading us to buy into? Sometimes it's material goods like expensive cutting boards, feces-milk, or cookbooks. But what unites them all is their desire to sell you a certain lifestyle, or rather the romanticization of a certain lifestyle, as a quote-unquote traditional woman, hence the name Tradwife. Some people think their accounts are harmless or even satirical. However, there is an inherent contradiction in their messaging that's troubling, no matter how subliminal or overt that messaging might be. Stay at home, have lots of kids, and be a good wife, while I film myself making millions off of brand deals and your views. What exactly happens in between the camera takes? We as viewers may never know for sure, but Carol Claire Burke provides an earnest attempt of taking us inside the minds of one of these women in her book Yesteryear, which follows the life of a Tradwife influencer named Natalie, and that's what I want to talk to you all about today. Welcome to Salted Latte, a place on the internet where I yap about prose of all varieties. I am very excited to get into this review. There's a lot to dive into when it comes to Yesteryear. A lot of it landed for me, but not all of it. I'm going to try and keep this review as spoiler-free as I can in case you do want to go ahead and read the book for yourself at some point. Maybe what I have to say will entice you, maybe it'll steer you further away, who knows. While I talk about my thoughts, I thought it would be fitting to have some footage of me cooking and meal prepping in the background, so enjoy that. If you're interested in any of the recipes for what I make, I'll try my best to remember to link them down below. Before we discuss what I liked and I didn't like, I'll read you the synopsis of Yesteryear in case you just happen to stumble upon this and are curious. Or maybe just need a refresher. My name was Natalie Heller Mills, and I was perfect at being alive. Natalie lives a traditional lifestyle. Her charming farmhouse is rustic, her husband a handsome cowboy, her 6 children each more delightful than the last. So what if there are nannies and producers behind the scenes, her kitchen hiding industrial-grade fridges and ovens, her husband the heir to a political dynasty. What Natalie's followers, all 8 million of them, don't know won't hurt them. And the angry women, the privileged Ivy League coastal elite haters who call her an anti-feminist iconoclast, they're sick with jealousy. Because Natalie isn't simply living the good life, she's living the ideal, and just so happens to be building an empire from it. Until one morning she wakes up in a life that isn't hers. Her home, her husband, her children, they're all familiar, but something's off. Her kitchen is warmed by a sputtering fire rather than electricity, her children are dirty and strange, and her soft-handed husband is suddenly a competent farmer. Just yesterday, Natalie was curating photos of homemade jam for her Instagram. Now she's expected to haul firewood and hand-wash clothes until her fingers bleed. Has she become the unwitting star of a ruthless reality show? Could it really be time travel? Is she being tested by God, by Satan? When Natalie suffers a brutal injury in the woods, she realizes 2 things. This is not her beautiful life, and she must escape by any means possible. A gripping, electrifying novel that is as darkly funny as it is frightening, Yesteryear is a gimlet-eyed look at tradition, fame, faith, and the grand performance of womanhood. Alright, let's get my complaining out of the way before we get into the good stuff. One of my biggest critiques that I have about Yesteryear is related to Natalie's characterization, specifically with regard to her relationship with religion. To me, it felt a bit confusing. At many points, it felt as though she viewed her Christianity at an arm's length, and at the moments when she was praying and talking to God directly, it came across as a little bit superficial to me. Like the quote I included in my thumbnail, for example, of Natalie thanking God for hitting another however many million Instagram followers. You could argue that this superficiality plays into the book's broader themes of the intersection of femininity and religion and their combined performance. However, that just doesn't feel feel realistic to me. As someone who grew up in a family that was adjacent to this fundamental conservative sphere, there is an aspect of theatrics to that brand of Christianity, yes, but for a lot of people, these ideas and this way of living are very, very real to them, even under the embellishments. And I don't feel like the author executed that as well as it could have been executed. To me, Natalie's character misses the mark on her religious adherence, especially for someone who has supposedly grown up in this realm. She wasn't a convert later on in life. This is all that she's ever known. And yet I was picking up on this distance between her and God for a lot of it. Much of Natalie's external actions match what we would expect from someone of her beliefs, but her internal motivations seemed a little disjointed. I think the main point I'm trying to make here is that there was a certain level of indoctrination I felt was missing from Natalie's character. There's so much flip-flopping between expressions of her belief, like during the chapters where she's back in the 1800s scenario and she views it as a test from God and she's expressing her gratitude for that. And yet she also has this internal monologue pointing out the inherent flaws in the systems she was supposedly believing in. This comes across like she is just using religion as part of some grifting scheme, and those kinds of people definitely do exist. But I don't think Natalie was meant to be that kind of character given the way that she was raised. Here are a couple examples of Natalie mentioning Christianity and womanhood to kind of show you what I mean. Quote, "A voice in my head echoing softly, America hates angry women. The Lord hates angry women. You hate angry women. Do not be an angry woman." And quote, "If you wanted to be a wealthy Christian woman and maintain good standing, you needed to publicly disavow your luxuries in order to maintain possession of them." End quote. These thoughts sound like they are from the perspective of someone who could be in the process of deconstructing their religion, or from someone on the outside looking in and making observations. Natalie is neither of these kinds of people. Good characters are nuanced and often have conflicting points of view. It's what makes them feel human-like on the page. I think it's the way these statements are worded that makes Natalie feel less real to me. It's too overtly self-aware that it makes her feel more like a caricature than a satire. It reads as a liberal woman writing what she thinks about fundamental Christians instead of how that fundy woman would actually be speaking and thinking of herself and of her religion and the other people around her that practice it and uphold it. There's a cynical undertone here that just doesn't completely match what Natalie's character is supposed to be, in my opinion. Hello, it's me currently editing this, but I just wanted to add onto this point. I think Yesteryear would have made for a more compelling story if during Natalie's time at college, instead of doubling down on her beliefs, she began to question a little bit the belief systems that she was raised on and those values she was raised on. And then when she meets her husband Caleb, the prospect of what she perceives to be comfort and safety from his family's immense amount of wealth and social privilege begins to battle with her internal desire to be a little bit more curious and open-minded about the world and about different points of view. And then after she marries him and starts her Instagram account, we could get to see that conflict continue through a lot of this cognitive dissonance between Natalie's external actions and some of her internal dialogue, like what I have just mentioned earlier in those quotes. I do think these kinds of statements would be fitting for a character like Natalie's sister Abigail, though, since she goes through her own little mini arc of disentangling herself from this severe interpretation of Christianity into something more moderate. I actually found myself wanting more of Abigail's character throughout my time reading. I know Yesteryear is supposed to be commentary about Tradwife influencers, but I found Abigail's journey super compelling too, and I appreciate that the author didn't use Abigail's character as a way to bash on religion as a whole and be like anti-religion as a whole. Abigail was able to find a way to balance maintaining her faith while also beginning to unlearn a lot of that harmful rhetoric. Another thing I thought was odd is that Natalie never goes to church. She and her family are never captured doing any sort of religious activities or celebrations outside of Natalie's prayers. And something else I found to be strange was how isolated she was from any sort of community. Some of this is on her as she consistently is pushing her sister away, but conservatism and many sects of Christianity thrive off of large groups of people and community organization. We might not always agree on what they're organizing for, but if there's one thing that Christians are good at, it's coming together in support of someone or to get something done. I understand how Natalie or anyone really could feel internally ostracized in this environment, but you're usually always surrounded by people. You're expected to be involved. That's part of the performance, is keeping up appearances, and Natalie and her family don't do any of this. Aside from Natalie's, performance of her online Instagram posts. They don't have a church that they frequent. They hardly see Natalie's mother and sister. Neither Natalie or her husband Caleb have any friends, which was really confusing to me because it comes across as the author thinking that all of these Tradwife influencers or people in that sort of category, instead of that desire for performance coming from a place of already being rooted in that religious culture, if that makes sense. It's like that core faith and ideology comes first, and then the online posting is a natural sort of progression of that. That brings me to another side point, which is that I wonder if the author spent enough time really trying to understand Natalie and where she comes from before jumping into berating her and picking her apart over the span of like 400 pages. From what I can find, the author grew up Catholic, which is a completely different branch of religion from fundamentalism or Mormonism, which are the biggest hubs, I believe, for Tradwife culture. She does also mention in interviews that she studied a lot of Tradwife influencers online and even signed up for several influencer boot camps. So it's not like she didn't do anything, but I feel like Tradwives in particular are a hard group to really understand unless you are one of them or grew up around them, because they can be quite image forward, both online and offline. And at a surface level, Natalie does fit the mold of that, but I think she just lacks some of that cultural depth. I've read in some interviews that the author Caro wrote the draft of the book in just a few months, and then the movie rights to the book were sold to Anne Hathaway when the book was still a draft. So, that situation and those time constraints could definitely have played a role in why I have these criticisms of Natalie. Natalie is a deeply irritating character throughout the entire story. And there is nothing inherently wrong with that. I wasn't going into this expecting her to be likable. Not all main characters have to be likable to make a compelling story. And like I mentioned earlier, I was raised around people who are similar to Natalie and her family, like in terms of the religious conservative stuff, not like the wealth and the politician stuff, but having come into the novel with that lived experience, I was able to view Natalie from a place of sympathy and humanity for her and aspects of what she goes through, especially the chapters that discuss her giving birth for the first time and feeling disillusioned during her early months of motherhood. However, I do worry that because she is written so snarkily, and also because of what I just was talking about earlier about her lacking some depth, many readers could write her off as just 100% evil and mean. And she did do a lot of terrible things, don't get me wrong, but she also had a lot of terrible things happen to her as well. Again, after she gives birth to her first daughter Clementine, Natalie suffers from what I believe is implied as postpartum depression, which goes untreated because she doesn't have a support system in place that actually cares about her and her recovery. She is thrust into motherhood ill-prepared because everything she was taught to believe about it was fabricated. That is a lot to process while also learning how to care for an entire new person. I don't think Natalie's character deserves to come off as one note. Not all of this should be on the author, though. Readers also need to be reading with nuance, especially for a story like this. But I do wonder if Natalie is set up to be so unlikable that she becomes dehumanized in the process, which also serves to flatten her character. With that being said, I did enjoy my reading of Yesteryear overall, even though I don't think it necessarily matches the level of depth that it was advertised as achieving. I think this book can still easily have a place as a starting point for important conversations about the topics it addresses. And even though I do have some qualms with Natalie's character representation, there is still a lot of truth in what she experiences throughout her story of navigating being a woman under such severe religious constraints. We we see this shine through most clearly, I think, in her relationships with the other women throughout the novel. For instance, there is a character named Shannon, which is Natalie's producer and videographer for her Instagram page. Natalie is quick to point out how non-traditional Shannon appears. She's got dyed hair and piercings. She points this out multiple times throughout the book. And she seems to have this strange fascination with Shannon, similarly to how she does with her former college roommate Rena. Sprinkled throughout the entire story, Natalie makes comments about both of these women, like I was saying. For Rena specifically, every time something goes wrong in Natalie's life, she fantasizes about where Rena could be in her life at that moment, and surely she is suffering a much, much worse fate. Natalie always has to, in her eyes, win over these other women as a way to validate the poor decisions she makes for herself. She loves perceiving all of the other women around her as suffering for making decisions that are different to hers. A big example of this is when Natalie gets married to her husband Caleb 6 months after meeting him. She gets pregnant quickly after and is now dropping out of Harvard, abandoning her education and her full ride scholarship to be Caleb's wife and to be a mother full-time. She bumps into Rena and shares this news with her with this air of short-sighted glee. And this is before she finds out the truth about motherhood. It might be quote-unquote natural in her eyes, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be easy. She doesn't realize this though yet. Here, Natalie believes that since she is doing everything she is supposed to be doing, her life will be far easier than Rena's, who will be ugly and alone forever because she's pursuing an internship for her eventual career instead. Natalie has this whole entire thought spiral conversation with herself that spans across almost 3 pages, just obsessing about what Rena's future is going to look like at every stage of her life and how miserable she's going to be. It's so detailed, and I'll read you a couple excerpts of it. I knew exactly what would come next. As long as Rena didn't screw up royally over the next few summers, she'd get a job offer from the firm after graduation. 6 figures right out of the gate, living the dream. She would start working 70 or 80 hours a week, subsisting mostly on a diet of cocaine and Red Bull. Her coworkers would comprise a bullpen of male colleagues, men who'd screwed the small handful of women in the office nonstop, personally and professionally. From here on out, Rena's life was going to be hard. She would have to work hard to get the job and hard to keep it, and even harder to get promoted. And any promotion she received would lead only to more work, more responsibilities, more hours in the office, and in the meantime she would have to squeeze out a few free hours a week to do everything else. Date, stay fit, buy groceries, see friends. And when the time came when Rena finally gave birth, when she finally looked around and realized she'd made it, she was at the top of the mountain. She had it all. The landscape would look like this. Her husband would no longer want to touch her, and her boss no longer wanted to promote her, and her childless friends no longer wanted to spend time with her, and her friends with children no longer had time to see her. And Rena, sweet precious Rena, would complain about none of it, not the disappearing husband or the flailing career or the crushing loneliness. Not a word of it to anyone, because she would technically be one of the lucky ones. And in the world that Rena would soon inhabit, you don't get to complain about those kinds of problems. You don't get to complain about privilege. And that entire monologue just becomes so ironic once you read farther into the book and you see what Natalie's life has become. Part of this obsession, I think, comes from Natalie's sheltered upbringing and her naivety, but I also think this obsession is a way for her to allow herself to be curious about Rena and other women like her under the guise of belittling them. Since she's backing herself into a situation where she'd never be free to explore that kind of lifestyle, she could fixate on it through her imagination. And I'm not surprised she does this because Natalie is a very book smart, very intelligent girl. I mean, she's smart enough to get a scholarship for Harvard. Her ambitious desires do not conform to the religious ideals she subscribes to, however, which is likely very challenging for her to work through. And because she has such a disparity between her cognitive and her emotional intelligence, she is not properly equipped to handle the complex feelings that arise in a situation like this. Natalie views things very black and white instead of understanding and accepting the nuances and often contradictions that come with just being a human being, but especially being a woman. She doesn't allow herself to acknowledge her actual desires because she is ashamed of them for not matching up perfectly with this idea of a traditional woman woman that she was raised to expect not only to become, but expect to want to become. And anytime someone brings up these complexities, Natalie's brain short circuits and relies on calling other women whores who hate themselves because they threaten to undo everything that Natalie grew up believing in. And she doesn't know what to do with that. It makes her very angry. Natalie spends the entire book pretending to be happy when she is an angry woman, which coincidentally is what she calls anyone who has critiques of her online. And Natalie misplaces that anger, targeting other women instead of the systems in place she chooses to uphold with her Instagram Tradwife content. Even the women in her family are not safe from Natalie's anger. She sees her eldest daughter as a threat as well. Natalie has a complicated relationship with Clementine, her daughter. One of the first interactions we read between the two is a brief conversation in which Clementine asks Natalie what a Tradwife is. In response to this, Natalie says, "It was an overwhelming task, protecting your child from the world. Jessa and Junebug, her other daughters, were still so young, so impressionable, but Clementine, practically a woman now. She couldn't be trusted." Clementine is only 12, by the way. But as she grows up and begins to gain a little bit more autonomy, her mother begins to view her more cynically. One of the most important parts in the book is when Natalie recounts giving birth to Clementine. She says, quote, "As my body slowly halved open like a peach, I realized it was me who was losing my life. Me who would vanish from the world to make room for this new child. For a single moment, I wished the child gone. Not just out of me, but out of this world, erased." What quote-unquote Natalie is she losing? She never gets to find out who she would be outside of motherhood because she rushed into it like it was some quota to be filled without thinking about the lifelong ramifications of it, because it's quote-unquote just what women do. And now she will never know what that version of herself would be like or had the capabilities of becoming. During this birth, Natalie's mother is entirely unhelpful. Natalie's at the hospital trying to adjust to an infant needing her 24/7. She's close to tears, saying she's not sure if she can do this. Her husband, Caleb, is no help at all. I don't even know where he is at this point, I forget, but her mother says, "Well, you have no choice now. She's already here, so you have to do it." "But I can't do it." "Of course you can." "How can you know?" "Because you have to." And then a little later on, Natalie says, "Right as I was about to drift into unsettled sleep, Clementine began to cry. My mother leaned over and whispered into my ear, 'Get up.'" It's very unsympathetic and cold, and I really felt for Natalie's character in that moment. Natalie has a lot of intrusive thoughts about Clementine during her infanthood and young childhood, and again, I believe this has to do with some kind of untreated postpartum depression. Natalie doesn't actually think Clementine is evil, even though in her head she calls her all sorts of names. She just has a lot of trauma because she wasn't properly prepared for the realities of giving birth, since she grew up very religious and was told it was just something natural that happens that women do, and she sort of filled in the blanks there and assumed that natural equated to innate, when nothing about your entire body and life changing forever and learning how to care for an entirely separate human being other than you is innate. Even if your body innately has that capability to do it, caregiving is not as instinctual as we think, especially for women, or maybe not even as we think, but just as we are socially brought up to believe, especially in these more conservative religious spheres. And Natalie truly believed it was going to be easy for her. She truly bought into that. To Natalie, Clementine is a mirror of herself and also a reminder of everything that she will never get to become, everything she didn't realize that she was giving up until it was too late. Natalie's sister Abigail comes to visit her after the birth. At this point, Abigail is married to the guy that she met in high school who treats her very horribly, and she already has a couple children at this point. She understands what Natalie is going through, and she tries to confide in her sister about this, about how difficult and how tiring motherhood actually is, and how inadequate and ill-prepared she feels. Abigail even brings up how she wants to go on birth control behind her husband's back because their religious beliefs don't allow for that. But Natalie rejects this offer of connection from her sister, instead yelling at her for being a liar and for being a sinner. Just like with Rena, Natalie lashes out in anger because she can't admit to herself the reality of this life that she's creating for herself, and also because it is hard for her to admit that she was sort of bamboozled by her mother and all of these other women and these other religious people that she grew up with. But again, she really bought into, what they were selling in terms of womanhood and being a wife and motherhood. And also Abigail coming to Natalie with this. And this is another instance of one of those complexities that Natalie can't address head on or think about for too long, because then it will, cause her to begin to think critically about her upbringing and about what she was brought up to believe in, and that is just very difficult for her to do. She can't admit that there is a way out, because then what excuse would she have for not trying to get out of this situation? Abigail does eventually escape from these confines by getting divorced and by starting over, which Natalie shames her for relentlessly. She essentially destroys her relationship with her sister because she couldn't handle being faced with prioritizing her actual quality of life over the performance of quality that she is at her core upset with all of these other women for lying to her about, and yet she is continuing to perpetuate that cycle. Now, there also is the element of time jumping with this book. Natalie wakes up one morning and it appears as though she's transported back in time to the 1850s. She's surrounded by children who seem familiar yet strangers, and a house with no modern conveniences, and seemingly no escape either. These chapters that are spliced up with chapters from the present that detail what I just mentioned, alongside Natalie's relationship with her husband, his politician father, and her social media facade. I enjoyed the structuring because it kept me hooked into the story. However, all in all, I do feel like we spent way less time in the 1850s compared to how this book was advertised. It was mostly recounting Natalie's upbringing until a certain altercation happens between her and Shannon and Caleb. Most of the 1850s chapters were much shorter than the other chapters, and after a certain point they did feel a little repetitive to me. Natalie helps the children tend to the chickens, Natalie prepares food, Natalie hates it here, she tries to escape, she can't escape, so on and so forth. Once you get to the end of the book, you can kind of see a little bit why those chapters are like this. I'm not going to tell you what happens at the end. I know this video is titled "I've read the book, so you don't have to," but I really do think you should read the book. I want you to. I know some people have said that they have found the ending to be a little lackluster. I was surprised by the twist at the end personally, but I did find myself wanting more out of Natalie's final interactions with Clementine specifically. That's all I'll say about that though. You'll have to pick up a copy and see for yourself. So that is what I thought of Yesteryear by Carol Claire Burke. As always, feel free to comment your thoughts and opinions as long as you keep it respectful. Are you planning to read this book? Have you read it already? And if so, what did you like or what did you have problems with? I'm excited to see that it's getting turned into a film. I think this is definitely the kind of novel I see translating really well on screen. And I'll also be interested to see the casting too whenever that comes out. I hope we get a lot of newer faces and more up and coming actors for the characters instead of the ones that we typically see on screen. I think that will help make the characters feel more real as well. Of course, I'd love it if you liked and subscribed to the channel. Like I said at the beginning of this video, over here at Salted Latte, I love to dive into and dissect other people's words, mostly in book form, but really all sorts of mediums, anything I'm interested in really at the moment, or anything you're interested in. Let me know if you've seen things floating around for me to talk about, or if you have any book recommendations, that'd be great too. I still gotta figure out what I'm reading next. But that's all I have to say for now. I'll talk to you all soon. Goodbye.